Hi, everyone. It's my great privilege and honor to welcome you to the book launch of Silky Shah's urgent new book, Unbuild Walls, Why Immigrant Justice Needs Abolition, just out now from Haymarket Books. Next week, there will begin a series of in-person events, including two in New York City, one at Blue Stockings on Sunday, May 12th, where Silky and I will be in conversation, and then one at the People's Forum on Tuesday, May 14th, with Alina Da, Sofia Gurule, Tanya Matos, and Mon Mohapatra, both in the evening. And there's going to be events all over the country as well. You can find more details online through the Detention Watch Network social media accounts. As we have this conversation this evening or this afternoon, depending on where you're at, students all over the country and the world, from Los Angeles to Chicago and New York City and Atlanta to the West Bank to Amsterdam to Athens and more, are mounting an incredible popular and militant resistance to Israel's brutal invasion and bombardment of Rafah and the complicity of their governments and universities therein. A few days ago, the director of the UN World Food Program said that parts of Gaza are in full-blown famine, with catastrophic levels of hunger taking hold. The official death toll hovers around 35,000, with thousands more unaccounted for. Meanwhile, university presidents work alongside police to repress and brutalize an internationalist student movement of the likes we haven't seen for decades, one that is remaking and contesting the very terms of US politics, a profound expression of discontent with the ruling class and both parties' commitment to the military and prison industrial complexes. I've heard from friends around the country that the students are disciplined and organized as they call us to stop what we are doing and attend to the most urgent and intersecting crises of our times. And that takes us in some sense to this book, because as much as Gaza and Palestine demand our attention, the daily and routine violence of the prison industrial complex, including via incarceration, detention, and deportation, do too. Our movements are interconnected, as are the struggles that millions of people world over face. In this extraordinary book, Silky Shah makes the argument that immigrant justice needs prison abolition, and she grounds her intervention in decades of organizing and running and supporting campaigns. Silky and I met in 2007 when we were both members of Asia Pacific Forum, an Asian American collective that put on a weekly radio show on WBAI in New York City. I feel so lucky to be her friend and to be here today to celebrate her book. She's been one of my most consistent and important teachers on political struggle through conversation, as has Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who will be in conversation with her tonight. My name is Amna Akbar, and I'm a law professor at The Ohio State University, and I'll be facilitating the conversation tonight. I'm going to read the bios for Silky and Ruthie, even though in some sense they seem unnecessary, before asking Silky to provide an overview of the book before we then engage in a conversation about the book and the political moment in which we're in. So Ruth Wilson Gilmore is professor of Earth and Environmental Sciences and director of the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics at the City University of New York Graduate Center. Co-founder of many grassroots organizations, Gilmore is the author of Abolition Geography, out from Verso in 2022, and of course Golden Gulag from the University of California Press in 2007. Change Everything is forthcoming next year from Haymarket. The Antipode documentary, Racial Capitalism with Ruth Wilson Gilmore, features her international work, and her many, many honors include the 2020 Lannan Foundation Lifetime Cultural Freedom Award, which Mike Davis and Angela Davis also received, and the 2022 Marguerite Casey Freedom Scholar Prize. Silky Shah has been working as an organizer on issues related to racial and migrant justice for over 2 decades. Originally from Texas, she began fighting the expansion of immigrant jails on the U.S.-Mexico border in the aftermath of 9/11. In 2009, she joined the staff of Detention Watch Network, a national coalition building power to abolish immigrant detention in the United States, and now she serves as its executive director. Her writing on immigration policy and organizing has been published in Truth Out, Teen Vogue, Inquest, and The Forge, and in multiple edited volumes, including The Jail is Everywhere and Resisting Borders and Technologies of Violence. She's also appeared in numerous national and local media outlets, including The Washington Post, NPR, and MSNBC. And of course, she is the author of Unbuild Walls, Why Immigrant Justice Needs Abolition. Ruthie, I just wanted to ask if you wanted to say a word about the book before we turn it over to Silky to kind of introduce the book's arc to the audience.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me all right? This is the cover of this beautiful book, Urgent Book, Necessary Book. It is a vital intervention, and we'll be talking about this today. The freedom to move around and the freedom to stay put are central to abolitionist vision. Silky Shah shows with lively detail how abolitionist political analysis is both preparation for and guidance through complex, difficult struggles. I don't remember when Silky and I first met. We've known each other a very long time. And through study and struggle and organizing and understanding, we've come to this moment, and I'm very pleased that we have. Silky.
Thank you so much. I have so much gratitude to you both, not just for everything both of you did to actually make this book possible, but for the lessons over many, many years, as Ruthie pointed out. And I also just want to quickly extend my gratitude to Haymarket Books and everybody there, and especially Maria Isabel Carlos, my editor, and for believing in this project, and to my incredible colleagues at Detention Watch Network. All of y'all have been so involved in this. So I'm going to share a bit of an overview of the book before we jump into conversation. Hopefully it's not too much. So my entire goal with this book was to make a case for abolition. And in this context, specifically prison abolition. And I do it in a few ways. I'll lay it out in sort of three elements of how I do it. First, I share the history of the system in order to show that immigration enforcement and the prison industrial complex are fully intertwined, and that the same logic that resulted in mass incarceration also has resulted in mass detention and mass deportation. The second way is to explain how reformist approaches have not only served to expand detention and deportation, but have also pitted communities against each other, which actually really doesn't help us get to where we want to go. And the last point is to show how actually a better understanding of these intersections between the PIC and immigration enforcement and having an abolitionist lens have helped us curb deportations and detentions of immigrants currently living in the United States. So, on the first point, how are these systems intertwined? Perhaps the most obvious connection is that the roots of these systems trace back to anti-Black racism. The modern detention system, as we know it, began in the early 1980s with the arrival of Haitian and Afro-Cuban migrants in South Florida. The US began to indefinitely detain Haitians in large numbers, deeming them economic migrants not worthy of asylum. And many advocates and political leaders began to question the systemic detention of Haitians. And in order to make it seem less racist, rather than releasing Haitians, the US government started applying a policy of de facto mandatory detention to a broader group of migrants. And in that case, it was largely Central American migrants who were fleeing US-backed wars in the region. So it was actually the logic of anti-Black racism and racism more generally that served to create and expand the detention system. There was also, of course, the war on drugs, which was in full swing by this point. Tough on crime laws were flourishing and at both the state and federal level. More and more people were being locked up, and the system started to snowball. INS had often used federal prison capacity to detain immigrants, but with a lack of space due to growing numbers of people in the prison system, INS starts to build and contract its own facilities and becomes a mass jailer in its own right. So it was the expansion of mass incarceration that sort of precipitated ICE becoming INS then, and then Immigration and Naturalization Service, and then eventually ICE having its own detention system. We also start to see these intersections play out at the federal level. In legislation in 1988, it was actually the Anti-Drug Abuse Act that officially legalizes mandatory detention of immigrants for certain crimes, and the list of those crimes would continue to expand over the next decade. And mandatory detention law essentially eliminates any form of due process for broad groups of immigrants at this stage. And of course, there's also the political economy of these systems, which Ruthie has done considerable work to shed light on. Like the prison boom, in which economically challenged rural communities began to see prison building as a form of economic development, those same theories were applied to the expansion of immigrant detention. As our comrade Tracy Hewling notes, from 1990 to 1999, 245 prisons were built in rural and small town communities, with a prison opening somewhere in rural America every 15 days. In the immigration context, this of course included the private prison industry, which is a byproduct of the rise of neoliberalism, but it also included many counties and localities vying for detention contracts in order to supplement local budgets with federal money. And the federal government eventually started bankrolling county jail expansion to warehouse more immigrants. And the last point I want to make about how the systems are intertwined is related to national security frameworks, which started to take shape in federal policy in the 1990s and expanded considerably after 9/11. While the war on terror is understood as a huge injection of resources and capital towards US militarism, the domestic war on terror often worked through the criminal legal system and became an extension of the war on crime. This meant more detention, more prisons, more policing at the border. And because of this, by 2004, immigration crimes become the most prosecuted offense in the federal courts. So that's a sort of quick, very, very quick summary of the interconnections, a lot of what I write about in the first part of the book. The second point I want to highlight is the ways that reformist approaches, which are often informed by the idea of the good immigrant versus bad immigrant, have only resulted in more detention and deportation, and also more divisions between our movements. In chapter 2, I unpack how this played out under the Obama administration. I will say writing that chapter was a good way to process what happened during those years. What was so damaging about that time is that Obama continuously affirmed the argument that immigration itself is a public safety issue. To be clear, it is not. Immigration is about family relationships, it's about labor and work, and of course, it's about seeking refuge. In the Obama administration's line of thinking, immigrants with criminal convictions were the core problem, and our way to quote unquote fix the system was to get better at targeting those immigrants who had encountered the criminal legal system in order to make the case for those who hadn't. Through programs like Secure Communities, the Obama administration more closely linked ICE with local jails, bringing more and more people into the system. So through these reforms, Obama was coined deporter-in-chief, and more formal deportations took place during those years than under any other president. And I think this particular distinction is really important. Formal deportations or removals, unlike expulsions or when people have voluntary departure, mean that people who are deported, if they're formally removed, have a 5-year bar to re-enter the country. And if they do try to re-enter and are caught by Border Patrol and prosecuted, they could get anywhere from 2 years to 20 years in federal prison. So you start to see more and more people in the federal prison system because more and more people are being deported, actually. This is the system that is then handed over to Trump. And then the Trump administration uses the carceral apparatus at the border, which has become that much more robust, to carry out systemic family separations in 2018. But it wasn't just Obama or the Democrats that played up the good versus bad immigrant frame. The mainstream parts of the immigrant rights movement, and especially lobbyists in DC, used the frame, good immigrant versus bad immigrant, to push for comprehensive immigration reform, which I write about in chapter 4. The logic of comprehensive immigration reform means trading off border militarization and more criminalization of migrants for mass legalization of the 11 million undocumented people living in the US. In order to make their case, Beltway groups emphasize immigrants as exceptional and as especially productive and patriotic and also relatively innocent. Often they leaned on the argument that immigrants commit less crimes than US citizens. In fact, many immigrant rights advocates make this argument repeatedly without any critique of the criminal legal system or the understanding of the anti-Black racism that underlies such comparisons. This sort of framing really ends up pitting working class communities against each other. It's sort of like the model minority myth, which is often applied to Asian Americans. If there is a model minority, then there is an implied non-model minority that is perceived as inferior and therefore disposable. Lastly, I show how, and this is where the hope comes in, which I promise is in the book. I show how having a better understanding of the relationship between the prison industrial complex and immigration enforcement and embracing abolition has actually helped us start winning campaigns. A good example of this is the proliferation of sanctuary policies because of Obama's use of the criminal legal system and the growing Black Lives Matter movement. Immigrant justice activists started to have a better understanding of how the criminal legal system collaborates with immigration and customs enforcement. As a result of grassroots organizing and advocacy, many localities and states blocked ICE's ability to target immigrants through the criminal legal system, bringing formal deportations down considerably. On immigrant detention specifically, for years, the advocacy community focused on improving conditions and pushed for alternatives, but the system kept growing and people kept dying and things weren't getting better. After we took on a more abolitionist approach to shut down detention centers and defund ICE, and also after the social and cultural shifts in light of the uprisings for Black lives in 2020, we start to actually win shutdown campaigns. And in the last 5 years, some 20 detention centers are no longer in use by ICE because of these efforts. So I will wrap up there, but I think together all these points are meant to really clarify why abolition is not just practical, but actually essential to our struggles for racial and migrant justice.
Thanks for that really helpful overview, Silky. I really can't emphasize enough what an incredible account the book offers of the PIC, with an emphasis on immigration enforcement and deportation, but a really acute understanding of how these systems kind of make one another up. It's been a very long time since I've done any kind of deportation defense or immigration law work, but when I did do it, I would often call Silky first, because precisely, and I know a lot of lawyers, I am a lawyer, so Silky knows more about immigration law than pretty much anyone else, and it's precisely because she's been doing the work at the heart of contesting the PIC with the focus on immigration enforcement and deportation for such a long time. And so there's so many different parts of the book that we could dig into in the next hour in this conversation together, precisely because your book, Ruthie was talking before about this idea of study and struggle, and your book really embodies kind of the intellectual discipline and importance of that dialectic, because one of the things that I think is really important about the book is that whether or not you're a brand new prison abolitionist organizing or organizer or immigrant justice organizer, or you're a scholar of the carceral state, I think there's so much to learn from this book and its rootedness in contemporary struggles and such a keen understanding of the carceral state that you offer. But what I was kind of hoping you'd start us off in talking about is, in some sense, the immigrant justice movement, because in a way, the book is, you could kind of imagine it as a letter to the immigrant justice movements in a way, by someone who's been at its forefront and a participant in it for decades. And so you're the executive director of the leading network of immigrant justice orgs, which some years ago embraced abolition of immigrant detention and deportation. So would you start by just, in some sense, just giving us a genealogy, a movement genealogy of how it is that DWN came to a place where it embraced abolitionist principles?
Yeah, and I definitely write about this in the book. I think for me in particular, and for my comrade Bob Leibel, who shows up in the book, we were young activists working in Texas, and actually our work around this, and this is when I first encountered Ruthie, was really in that, what at the time we called the criminal justice advocacy space. And we were really siloed from the immigration space. And also the other thing to name for everybody who's watching, the civil society infrastructure around immigrant rights and even criminal justice advocacy was much less in those periods, especially after 9/11. Like, there wasn't actually the level of infrastructure sometimes that we see now, the number of organizations, the number of folks working on detention at the time. Nobody knew what detention was. For the most part, people would be like, oh, so you work on Guantanamo. So there wasn't this understanding. And I think for us, we were actually much more in this sort of criminal justice advocacy space. And and there was like this sort of immigrant rights space, and those things really didn't connect. But at Detention Watch Network, we started to see, okay, here's a place that connects, although still sort of DWN, Detention Watch Network, really was in the sort of immigration side of things. And so once I got to DWN, Obama had just taken office, and there was all this hope. It was like, okay, we're going to actually reform the system. Things are going to be so much better. Oh my God, there's this working group where ICE can interact with NGOs, and we're going to influence the way ICE does this. Just wild to even think that we took this seriously. But you know, all of the things that started to happen, and you know, again, I write about this in chapter 2, is first, again, Obama really expands secure communities and these models to target more immigrants through the criminal legal system. And then on the flip side, on the detention side, the idea actually became around, well, immigrants aren't going through criminal proceedings. So actually, because they're in civil proceedings, they deserve better. Totally contradictory ideas, actually. But in that process, what we started to see was actually an expansion of detention for nicer, more humane facilities that actually ended up just detaining people who they said were not their priority. They're like, oh, these are low risk folks. These are not the people that we actually, but but these nicer facilities are for them. So much of what we saw was that every single reform proposed, whether it was alternatives to detention or concerns around conditions or risk assessment tools, all of those pieces that had been tried ad nauseum by criminal justice advocates that didn't reduce incarceration, didn't decarcerate, were the same things that the Obama administration was trying, and the system kept expanding. And it was really, I really do think that sort of end of Obama's first term was such a key moment, because we started to see, I mean, we were over 400,000 formal deportations, over 400,000 people detained every year. And people were really frustrated. And at Detention Watch Network, our framework was detention as a last resort. And we're all just like, what does that even mean? Why are we doing this? And so we started to have pretty contentious conversations with the membership. We actually reached out to Critical Resistance and got a lot of guidance for our comrade, Rachel Herdzine, and really thought about how to bring people along to this sort of question of abolition. And so I think that was, you know, it was both a combination of Obama's approach and also the, like, to use the criminal legal system more and the rise of deportations. I also, like I mentioned, I do think the increase of Black Lives Matter movement activation, like all of that was really, really present. And of course, the immigrant youth movement that was really coming out of the shadows and really pushing for, you know, the Dream Act, but really just pushing for not being deported, essentially. And all those things, I think, combined made people start sort of seeing these connections and gave us space to say, actually, maybe nobody needs to be detained. Maybe we can really push towards what eventually the campaign that launched in 2014, Not One More Deportation, really said, which at the time, I think so many of the organizers didn't consider it a abolitionist framework. But really, when you think about Not One More Deportation, it's really essentially calling for an abolition of deportation. So it's a little bit of the genealogy.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And you provide a lot more of it in the book. Ruthie, I wanted to turn to you. So there's so many different dimensions of this that we could get into. But one of your key contributions to how we understand the world we live in, as kind of providing a flesh on the bones to concepts like capitalism or racial capitalism, is this framework of organized abandonment and organized violence that you use and has become very popular, I think, in social movement ecosystems in the United States. And so I was hoping you would talk a little bit about what you mean by that, and where and how Silky's book and immigration enforcement fit into that in your view.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thanks. And thanks for that overview, Silky. It was fantastic. I'm really excited to learn how many different organizations and movements not only in the US, but around the world, have taken up this framework and are working with it. And so I'll talk for a few minutes about the framework and then draw us back through Silky's book to what's going on right now all over the United States. For a long time, I and others were trying to figure out how to make a general argument about the prison industrial complex, about mass incarceration, about all of those big things that we'd been organizing against and analyzing to death and trying to build movements to undo. And one of the concepts that I'd come across many decades ago and then encountered again in the early 1990s was just this pair of words, organized abandonment. And I used it again in the 90s, but I didn't think to build a way of understanding what was going on through it until relatively recently. But the thinking about organized abandonment is to understand that the dynamics, the churn, the pushes and pulls that leave people in such a situation that their communities no longer have what is needed to sustain them, or people are unable to stay where they used to be, or the jobs have left, or climate change has produced desertification or inundation of areas, or privatization of what should be free to all, like water and air, and actually I think land, have produced dislocations as well. All of these, whether we're looking at capital, state, international financial institutions, and even NGOs, displace people. And the point here is to think that this abandonment is organized, not disorganized. It's not an afterthought that so many people's lives are thrown into disarray, but rather is part of a program of moving capital, moving labor, militarizing the planet, and so forth. So that's the first part. And that's conceptually what a lot of people have found, I think, really useful in trying to think about who are the decision makers who have managed to produce organized abandonment of various communities, regions, industrial sectors, and so forth around the world. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that when so many people find their lives in churn, so many people are compelled to change what they're doing, whether it's in the household, in the neighborhood, in their ability to make a living, in their ability to send remittances, in their ability to do all kinds of things. The forces of organized violence come in to manage that churn at the edge, and that edge becomes deeper and deeper and deeper. So the easy way for us to think about this as we're talking this evening is to think about that in terms of criminalization, or the production of enemies, if criminalization seems a little too specific or abstract. The forces of organized violence over the entire period that Silky has written this terrific book about, and even longer, have been growing in not only size, not only resources, not only money and personnel, but also in legitimacy and, as it were, political prestige. So that means not only that somebody like Obama and his administration made the determinations that you, Silky, laid out so beautifully that led to the capacity for Obama to be deporter in chief, but also that all kinds of institutional actors, some labor unions, some appointed personnel, some elected people also clamored for that particular outcome to happen. This is not excusing Obama. It's reminding us that one person doesn't make things happen, that abandonment is organized, and that means a lot of people and decisions come together in particular ways. So the forces of organized abandonment having aggrandized so remarkably, again, in many places, both in the public sector, police, prisons, and so forth, and as it were, the rise of a certain kind of opportunistic or imitative strategy on the part of certain private actors. So we can see the dominance of certain private actors in immigrant detention facilities, and the imitation of criminalization and policing within agencies that are not supposed to be doing that, like education and social work, that become deputized by their own determination that becoming more like police will guarantee them the resources they need to be able to do the other things they're supposed to do. All of this comes together in the US and in other countries as well. So I just want to say one thing about what's going on today around the United States and campuses. Many people scratch their head and say, well, gosh, how come the president of Columbia or the chancellor of CUNY or the chancellor of UCLA or the president of the University of Chicago or all of these other, chief executives of universities called the police? And my comrade, Craig Gilmore, with whom I think everything, said, actually, it's quite likely the police called them and proposed, you have a problem, we have the solution. So this is the world we live in. And I'm very excited that people can use the framework that I offer to think about it. And I'm very glad that before we wind up today, we will talk about success and hope, as well as the dire and dreadful.
If I could respond really quickly, I think one of the things that was sort of going around last week was this sort of actually, who are the board of trustees of Columbia University? And it emerged that Jay Johnson, who is the former secretary of DHS, is actually not only on the board of trustees of Columbia, but also on the board of Lockheed Martin. And I think there's this way that we often, so much of the sort of way we talk about this in the immigrant justice space as well, there's a revolving door between the private industry, the private prison industry, and ICE and DHS. And, I think the sort of important distinction to make, and I spend a lot of time in chapter 5 writing about this, is that a lot of what's happening here, it's not unique that private prisons are so bad, as Ruthie has written about so much, but more that actually the government is aligned with private prison companies. It's not that they themselves are this very evil entity. It's, as Ruthie has been explaining, those things are all very connected and they're working in tandem, and we need to understand who the targets are in that context, as opposed to the private prisons. It's actually the government that's making the choice to do those contracts. But when I thought about it, I was like, well, it wasn't just that Jay Johnson was now on the board of trustees of Columbia. It's also Janet Napolitano, who was the first DHS secretary under Obama also then went on to become the president of the University of California system. And so you just have this not just revolving door between the private industry and the US government and federal government, but also at the head of academia. And so that actually explains so much of this moment.
Yeah. Silky, I'm going to change gears a little bit. You wrote the books very rapidly, impressively so, but the world does feel like it's moving very fast these days. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the moment in which the book is coming out, whether it's about this particular moment in the border crisis and the carceral economy, or the moment in which it's coming into the immigrant justice movement. What, if anything, has changed, or how specifically does the book help us think about what's happening at the time of its release?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think when I was writing it, I often thought, oh, this book is kind of coming too late. Is this, useful actually? And then I remember sort of learning the news about what was happening with the supplemental bill that Biden was really pushing in the fall. And the whole premise of the bill was, let's get more aid to Israel and also Ukraine and Taiwan. And in order to get the Republicans on board, we're going to make a quote unquote border deal. And so it was a wild, actually, shift. I spend a lot of time in chapter 4 talking about those trade-offs around comprehensive immigration reform. And so for years, it was the Democrats and also these sort of beltway groups in DC constantly ceding ground to Republicans that actually just moved everything further and further to the right. And we've gone so far in that direction that actually now the sort of floor is not legalization for more border militarization and the end of asylum and all the other things, but actually it's kind of anything for more border militarization and all the things. So it was a wild moment. And I think it's, even though whenever you have a book, it's not always the most timely thing since I finished writing last year, but I do think that sort of analysis of that sort of trade-off really informs how far the Democrats have literally no vision when it comes to this issue, which is just absolutely remarkable. It's such a wasted opportunity. And in their minds, they're like, oh, wow, we showed how Trump and all the Republicans are actually not willing to move on border. And look, we tried to do this. And from their perspective, like, we're saving democracy by moving to the right on immigration, when in fact, in so many ways, they're just ceding more and more ground to the Republicans, which they continue to do. So I think that's a piece of this moment. I also think, and I really do think the sort of framework of organized abandonment is really helpful to think about in the context of what's happening with Greg Abbott in Texas. And essentially, Abbott is completely dictating immigration policy right now, both through the busing of migrants to quote unquote sanctuary cities, New York City, Chicago, and elsewhere, Denver, but also through Operation Lone Star and the policies in Texas that are so insidious. You have, so much law enforcement, so much money going to this. And I write about this at the end of the book, but you just see these like really it is the prison industrial complex in like another, it's sort of like exponential prosecutions for people who are quote unquote smuggling migrants, who there's now a 10-year mandatory minimum actually for if you have somebody who's undocumented in your car and you're caught like that, you could end up in prison for 10 years. Also, whenever we were sort of witnessing what was happening at the border, all these law enforcement officers from all across Texas and even Louisiana and other places were there to help with Operation Lone Star. And the local motel started upgrading their rooms because they're like, well, these law enforcement officers want something nicer. Like, you just see the way that actually it's all a part of the carceral economy. Mm-hmm. And then just the thing I would just say about New York, there was at some point like this sort of framework of a migrant crime wave, which was of course a lot of nonsense. But I think there's a lot of frustration with inequality, with the housing crisis, with a lot of things that are a problem in New York City. But that gets displaced onto migrants because both the infrastructure and the social safety nets are not there in the same way when you actually had similar numbers coming 10 years ago, but also because the Biden administration has just basically let Abbott run the show and is not intervening to actually support in any way. And so all of those things, I think, are, there are pieces of it in the book, but I do think that my hope is that with some of this analysis, folks can have a little bit of a lens on how these things are evolving, which they obviously will continue to evolve. And even, regardless of whatever happens in November, the conditions, there's a lot that we're going to be negotiating around this issue.
Yeah. Ruthie?
Yeah. Thanks, Silky, for thickening our understanding of these things. And I think I want to disagree with you a little bit in a totally comradely way.
Yeah.
I actually don't think the Democratic Party lacks a vision. They have a vision. And the vision is to allow the right to take charge of what they themselves, as you were saying, are not going to openly take charge of, and let the criminalization of more and more people develop so that they can pretend to have clean hands, but only pretend, while trying to figure out how they're going to cobble together enough voters to be reelected in the fall. Now, in the UK, it's quite likely that the next prime minister will be the so-called Labour candidate Keir Starmer, and not a continuation of the Tory party. And we see exactly the same kinds of relations unfolding around, particularly but not exclusively, the question of immigration. So there it's stop the boats rather than seal the borders. And there they're talking about deporting people who are asylum seekers to Rwanda. And they passed a law to make that possible. I mean, it's just sort of one thing after another, but we see similar things unfolding, which is to say, the parties of the center are no longer anywhere in the center. They're really on the right. They are, I think, if they have a vision, it's to try to domesticate fascism so that it doesn't erupt in the way they think it's going to erupt. But what they're really doing is paving the way for more fascism.
Yeah. I take that point completely. And I do think, so I think that the important thing to get across, and what I hope comes across really clearly, is that it was both Republicans and Democrats that built this system. And in fact, it was under Clinton and Obama that we see some of the harshest changes to the system that got us to this point. So I think that is very, very fairly taken point.
For those who are only listening, I agree 100%.
It's funny, your conversation kind of mimics some of the debates that people were having in social movement ecosystems like some years ago about, remember the debate about, is the criminal justice system working or is it broken, right? I mean, it's kind of like a similar conversation we just had. Okay, so we want to make sure we have time for questions, and I was hoping to touch on two different things, but I think I'm just going to try to do a combo, and then we'll see how far we get in talking about them. So on the one hand, and Ruthie was emphasizing the importance of this, which I agree, we should talk about things that are inspiring and important that are happening in movement, social change work. And in fact, one of the things that's the most inspiring about the book is its insistence and proliferation of examples of what Miriam Kaba calls hope as a discipline. You talk about so many different concrete campaigns and wins and strategies around the country, around jail fights and more, and document in really inspiring ways the actual political work people are doing and have been doing in the immigrant justice and prison abolition space. And then obviously we're living through an almost unbelievable movement moment of students engaged in strategic and militant action to disrupt the campuses and the country more broadly as a way to disrupt the country and universities' complicity in Israel's genocide. And so just thinking about both what's happening on campuses and in your long experience for both of you doing organizing and activist work, what are examples or things that you go to in terms of work that keeps you grounded and that kind of provides you return to for lessons for what we should be doing every day?
Should I start, I guess? I think one of the things that was so great about working on this project was actually having that sort of longer arc and not being so, the US is pathologically ahistorical, and so there's this way that we kind of think about this current moment and how terrible things are, but not really see the sort of change that's happened over time. And I think in the immigrant justice movement, for me, I think it feels really tough, and I really do, it's a hard moment. But when I think about the things that have happened over time and what I sort of alluded to, the anti-detention campaigns, the reduction in formal deportations of people living currently in the US, it's actually not politically popular to target community members in the way that it was during those Bush and Obama years and how rampant it was. So that I hold on to, and I hold on to like how much actually that was because of grassroots activism and people rising up. I also think this moment around solidarity with Palestinians, with the people of Palestine, has been, it makes me think about a few things. I mean, one, when you look back at the history of a sort of immigrant rights struggle, often there's this history of the sanctuary movement of the 1980s, which was actually very, very internationalist and very, very understanding of the role that the US was playing in Central America and beyond, and creating the conditions for people to seek refuge despite all that, and really in communication with people outside the US. And what's really happened, and as I sort of named with this like greater civil society infrastructure around immigration and this really big push for CIR over the last 20 years, there's actually not as much connection to, it's not an internationalist movement. And at the end of the book, I make this point really clearly. And it's not even, a lot of the book is about it not being a racial justice movement, but how it's shifted over time. But it's also not an anti-imperialist movement. And there's a lot we can say about that. And so I think, in recent years, and I think there was, this particular moment for it very much, the immigrant rights movement was the like progressive but Palestine framework. And a few years ago, a lot of folks came together and said, no, we're gonna not be that anymore. And there was a effort to drop the ADL, drop the Anti-Defamation League, and really understand both its role more broadly on sort of Zionist approaches, but also against our social movements in the US, and starting to see those connections. And, Detention Watch Network signed on to the call to drop the ADL. And it was a challenge. I think people were, some organizations struggled with that. Some organizations left DWN, but also United We Dream also signed on. Other groups also that were kind of trying to like really having strong connections to Movement for Black Lives and other organizations, and in making those connections, I think that was such an important moment that allowed us to kind of start bridging across movement and seeing actually how now, we had this sort of immigrant justice letter on Palestine, and we sort of recirculated today, given everything that's happening in Rafah right now. And those sort of points, that the fact that Gaza is a laboratory for a lot of the systems of control that we see at the US-Mexico border. The fact that so much of our work to defund ICE and CBP and, these defense contractors and prison contractors is actually tied to a lot of the work to defund the US military and the role that it plays in Palestine and Gaza. So I think that all actually has shifted over time, and that gives me a lot of hope to see that we don't and it's so actually quite essential in so many ways that we have that broader internationalist perspective. And I think it's been tough. I think a lot of groups have been affected, both in terms of funding and in relationships, but people have been really willing to go out, and that gives me a lot of hope.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So much to talk about. Let me try to be concise. One thing that comes to mind, I'm just going to say it and we'll discuss it later if we have time, is that the tendency toward privatizing public functions has been really deep in the U.S. military for a while. So not only is there an entire, private infrastructure that makes the military possible, i.e., all of the manufacturers and designers of weapons and warfare materiel, but also as the standing army or standing military of the U.S. has diminished over time, it's been supplemented by, contractors all over the place. So I just want to say that because it's not unlike what's happened with INS and ICE, even though we also know, and Silky, of course, you point out in your book, and Marlene Ramos shows in her research that the public jail infrastructure, for example, was something that local officials tried very hard to make available to the INS in the 80s. So this is like long before many of the things that we're talking about. So that as one point. The second is that in terms of the things that I find really inspiring and exciting, as well as difficult. One of the longest term fights that we had anywhere was over whether the County of Los Angeles would build a new men's jail, a new jail for men and a new jail for women. So these are not specific to migrants, but part of the larger infrastructure. And in the early days, when the county was considering this, they were under a consent decree, like many, many, many carceral agencies have been in the United States over time because of unconstitutional conditions of confinement or whatever. And the conclusion that many of the NGOs, the ACLU of Los Angeles and so on and so forth came to was, we need a new jail so that it will meet the standards to put people in cages. So this is not unlike what you were talking about a while ago, Silky. And what happened in LA was that struggle turned into a larger and larger struggle on the ground of people trying to stop that LA jail. And that effort brought abolition thinking into so many places it had not existed before. Brought it in, helped it to flower. So we worked very closely with labor unions, with local communities, with all different kinds of people. And eventually, we stopped that jail. The struggle was so long that the win, which is only ever as long as you've won, right? Could be the next day they'll start a new one. But the struggle was so long that people who came up in the movement, who came up through Californians United for a Responsible Budget, or who came up through critical resistance, starting as teenagers, are now in leadership positions. And like Eunice Hernandez is a member of the LA City Council. So, these are things that were moving forward. So we didn't win either by having somebody elected to the city council, but rather this is one of the many ways we can enliven abolition in the consciousness of people who wonder deeply why and how they've been so deeply abandoned, and how come the forces of organized violence seem always to be the only response to their needs. And then the last thing I want to say is there is so much internationalism on the one hand, especially about Palestine, but also internationalism around land grabs and the displacement of people in rural communities everywhere, most notably the very, very well organized social movement MST in Brazil, shack dweller movements, which are growing in intensity as the number of people on the planet are more and more living in urban areas. And abolition is starting to make sense for people who used to think that the way to solve the struggles over social disharmony in the communities that they themselves built was to have police present. So that's another example of internationalism via Campesina and so forth. So there are lots of things that give me a lot of hope.
Thanks to you both. We have a lot of great questions, so I want to turn to them now, but I will say for me, one of the struggles that has been giving me hope for the last few years is the struggle against Cop City in Atlanta, and the way that Atlanta is right now such a kind of important place for abolitionist struggle and its connections to internationalism. I mean, some of the images that were coming from Atlanta specifically showing struggles between the police and students in the encampments just had a level of kind of militancy and familiarity in a way that was like hard for me to understand without understanding it in the context of the fact that the police departments in Atlanta know that these students and the student movement is deeply entangled with this other movement, the Stop Cop City movement, and of course the effort to stop the Georgia-Israel law enforcement exchange in a way that gave it a different kind of, or a particular edge, let me put it that way. Okay, so I'm just going to read the first question because I think it's great and important. I think you'll love it, Silky, from our audience. What would you say is the call to action coming from your book? How can we best support those working for positive change on the ground level at the border and immigrant communities, and those directing the larger narrative to human rights? I love this question because in some sense, I feel like this question is precisely the question the book is designed to give readers to answer. So why don't you tell us?
What is the call to action? So I mean, I think the like very specific call to action, and this is part of the reason why it's called Unbuild Walls. It's not just the physical structures, the border wall, et cetera. It's actually, let's unbuild the walls between our movements for social change. We still have to make a very specific case often around a campaign, et cetera. But if we don't have a sort of broader understanding, often there are unintended consequences. So a good example of this that I write about in the book, which things are shifting already, but Louisiana, for instance, started to decarcerate to some degree, and some 6,000, 7,000 prison beds became available. And this was during the Trump era where ICE just swooped in and started to have a lot more detention. Louisiana became one of the highest places of detention in the country. And so often you see this, and the thing and I write about this in the book, so many of these jails where we've actually won fights, those jails are still open. They still exist. Sometimes they continue to hold people in pretrial detention for those local counties or maybe surrounding counties, or, hold people for the U.S. Marshals Service. And so all of these facilities sort of end up being recycled because, again, like part of what's going on is that they're dependent on the jobs and the revenue that comes in by just having the jails, and whether they're private or not doesn't really matter. This is all about the market and how it's working and how it relates to jobs. And so my hope is that people on the ground, and we've seen this in different places. I think Atlanta is one case in terms of the Atlanta City Jail and how much organizing actually happened between immigrant justice and decarceration folks. But like, start working together. It can't be just, happening in a vacuum. It actually hurts us to have these conversations in a vacuum, because if you have a win, it doesn't necessarily mean that jail shuts down or, that people might be shipped elsewhere. There's a lot of points around that. And so I think that's one call to action. Stop thinking about our movements as fully siloed. They are working in tandem. They're working towards similar goals. Let's really think about it that way. And sort of aligned with that is actually, let's stop talking about it in that way. So the immigrants commit less crimes, the sort of good immigrant versus bad immigrant frame. I think it's so important for us to, it's like very easy to fall back on these sort of arguments about immigrant exceptionalism. And in some ways, I mean, even now with the way that we talk about asylum, the whole narrative is just like immigrants are desperate and they're, they like basically takes away all the agency from people who actually have struggled a lot and persevered in so many ways. And that's not what this is about. And it pits us against each other. The more we understand that we're in this collective together, the more we're going to be able to move towards justice for more people. So I think that's really important. And, I really do feel like in so many ways, this moment, the pandemic, what's happening in Palestine right now, the sort of post-2020 moment, people are seeing, actually, we don't want to spend all of our money and resources on things that do harm, that continue to do harm, that are sort of in this like punishment mindset and militarism. But actually, we want those things that are going to create better social safety nets, really not be in this sort of zero-sum thinking. And that is really just what's so essential about our work right now, is breaking from that, and not, I think it's hard, because actually, from my perspective, our best way to make the case for immigrants is actually making things and the conditions for people in the US better. Like, it actually, like in so many ways, because people's conditions are not great, it makes it harder to make the case for immigrants.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I want to actually read one paragraph from it's the last paragraph in the penultimate chapter, because I think it responds to this question, and then we'll have time for one more question, which is for both of you, about the connection. I'll read it, but it's about the connection between immigrant justice and Palestinian liberation. So the paragraph in the penultimate chapter is, it's important to remember that abolition is about sustained organizing and movement building. It's about doing the work, not just making a demand. Yes, the demand is important. It helps clarify where we're going and opens up space for us to make our case to reduce the harm caused by the prison industrial complex. But our ability to create change is dependent on the power that we have. It requires building a base, identifying targets, developing strategies, waging campaigns, deploying various tactics, and harnessing our power when there are openings. That is the work, that is abolition. Okay, so the last question, which is to both of you, and again, I'll read it. It's a little hard to think about much of anything, least of all walls and borders, without Palestine immediately coming to mind. Can the speakers touch on some of the connections between the struggle for immigrant justice and Palestinian liberation? Ruthie, do you want to start this time?
Yeah. Sure. So let me start with something I said at the very beginning of our launch this afternoon, and that is that the ability, we can even call it a right, the right to stay put and the right to move around are both central to the vision of abolition. And I mean that completely, not partially. I mean that in terms of people such as the people of Gaza who would like to stay where they are because it's home, or the people in Gaza who would like to go home because home used to be on the other side of the border, or people around the world who are a part of the Palestine diaspora who would like to return home. That all of these are essential to the vision of abolition, not marginal to it. That said, it's also true to connect what is happening today in Rafah, where I was 34 years ago, 34 years and 2 months ago, almost to the day I was there. That the kind of violence unleashed on the people who live and who die in Gaza is violence intended to produce power. So rather than thinking that power enables you to enact violence on people, it's the other way around. That violence unimpeded is what one kind of power is made of. But, since the warfare there and the warfare around the world for people to have the ability to stay put or go wandering is so much defined by the forces of organized violence, whether police, military, private thugs, fascist gangs like those who attacked the students at UCLA and so forth, means that what we're engaged in is this enormous asymmetrical war, which is the long history of capitalist modernity. So we go from Rafah to 500 and some odd years. And if it's asymmetrical, it means, now here I'm just echoing the things that Silky wrote and that you, Amna, read from the latter part of the book, that we have to figure out and have figured out how to make power that does not necessarily derive from violence. Sometimes that is essential, the application of violence. It's also true a lot of power is made by the combined energy of people doing things otherwise. And that is something that we see, whether we see in the radical anti-capitalist land occupations in Brazil or elsewhere. I mean, I'll just use the examples I use a lot these days. None of what I just said resolves the horror of what is happening in Gaza, but it can give us some insight into how that kind of model of behavior, apply violence, produce power, compels many people to think that the only way to solve problems is by imitating that kind of action. There's a well-known story, whether it's urban myth or factual, I'm not sure, but there are some social psychologists who have proven that there's a lot of fact to it. Whenever there's an execution, the murder rate goes up. So whenever the state officially executes somebody, people are more likely to imitate that action to solve other kinds of problems by killing people. And taking that more generally, I think we can see that in the context both of the war that is still unfolding in Gaza and in the West Bank, not only in Gaza, lots of people are dying in the West Bank and attacked in East Jerusalem. That is going on at the same time that many wars are happening elsewhere, and the weapons used for those wars, most of them were produced by US firms and companies. And then if we go down the ladder, some Israeli, some Belarus, and a few others. But most of them are the product of the US military-industrial complex. So putting all of this together reminds us that the scope of all of the struggles that we're talking about today and trying to understand, the scope of organized abandonment and of organized violence, in particularly how those are brought together under the sign of the vulnerable migrant, is also part of contemporary imperialism and part of the ways that capitalism is constantly trying to solve the problems of capitalism by applying more capitalism, and the outcome is always misery.
I feel like that's a very good place to end, and it's that was incredible, Ruthie. Thank you so much.
We are basically at time. Is there anything you want to say before we close, Silky?
I mean, I think as you were talking, Ruthie, a lot of what I was thinking about was, so much of our sort of thinking about how to tackle what's happening in Texas around Operation Lone Star and what Greg Abbott is doing is actually the Department of Public Safety. Of course, that's the name of it. And it's these state troopers who have taken over a park in Eagle Pass and to kind of basically carry out, targeting immigrants, staging site, and then, prosecuting them, and sort of trying to really go after the Department of Public Safety, the state troopers that work there. And, a week, 10 days ago, whenever this happened, watching, I went to the University of Texas at Austin, and at the beginning of the Iraq War, I mean, we protested a lot. We were there a lot. We never experienced what people in the encampments now are experiencing, actually, that 20 years ago. And seeing those same state troopers that are targeting migrants at the border, that are getting an injection of funds from the state government, billions of dollars to target migrants, also then going after those who are calling attention to what's happening through U.S. complicity in Gaza and Palestine and the West Bank, et cetera. These are all connected. So I think that's the thing I would say. These aren't, in so many ways, Unbuild Walls is really about those connections between the prison industrial complex and the immigration enforcement system, but there's connections much more beyond that as well. And that's what we're seeing right now.
Thanks, Silky. Well, thanks to both of you for joining us this evening and celebrating Silky's book. Thanks to Haymarket Books for hosting. And thanks to all of you who tuned in tonight. Good evening.
Thank you, Amna. And thank you,
Congratulations. Thank you.